So I'll be talking about various potential threats from the modern sciences of the mind to autonomy and free will and moral responsibility. And just to get us started, increasingly we should note that scientists have been suggesting that their research poses just such threats. Here's just a couple quotes about that. Daniel Wegner ends his famous book. Oh no, we just lost it. Yeah. Let's see how long it takes for that to catch back up.
See why people don't use PowerPoint.
Okay. So Daniel Wegner ends his book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, saying, "It seems we are agents. It seems we cause what we do. It's sobering and ultimately accurate to call all this an illusion." Psychologist John Bargh says, "This strong feeling of freedom is an illusion, just as much as we experience the sun moving through the sky. Since these people call free will an illusion, I like to call them the illusionists." Here's a couple of neuroscientists. Josh Green and Jonathan Cohen say free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion. Patrick Haggard, "We certainly don't have free will, not in the sense we think." It's very important for these claims that they're sort of emphasizing that our ordinary understanding of free will is the target here. They seem to have an argument schema like this in mind. Science shows that X is the case. We ordinarily understand free will or autonomy to require not X. So science shows that free will and autonomy are illusions. And we need to examine this argument, or the arguments they have in mind, because these scientific claims are being widely publicized in the popular press, and they apparently may matter, because psychologists like Kathleen Vohs and Jonathan Schooler and Roy Baumeister have done experiments where they give people passages, for instance from Francis Crick, that say science proves that we lack free will, and the people that read those passages compared to controls cheat more on little math tests they take, and they steal more, and they act more aggressively, and they help less. And I'm working now with Vohs and Schooler on sort of fine-tuning what's driving these effects and how broadly they reach, and I can talk about that later if you want. But that's just to kind of motivate us that this matters, or may matter, for things like discussions of legal responsibility and the way we praise and blame each other. So that's to motivate us, but here's what I'll be doing today. First, since most of the illusionists talk in terms of free will, I'll explain how I understand autonomy and its relationships to free will and moral responsibility. Then I'll go through the ways illusionists may think science threatens freedom and autonomy, arguing first that the threat shouldn't be confused with the traditional threat from determinism. Then I'll respond to the various ways neuroscience might be taken to threaten free will and autonomy, and I'll argue that those threats miss the mark. I didn't start my clock. How long have I been? About 5 minutes so far.
Okay, tell us the story.
But that doesn't tell you the story. But that doesn't mean we're out of the woods, because I'm going to talk about a more significant threat to free will that comes from research in social psychology. So in the second half of the talk, I'll discuss that threat to autonomy and possible responses to it. But just in case you're asleep by then, I'll give you the punchline now. We should analyze autonomy as a set of capacities for reasoning and self-control that people possess to varying degrees, and that are amenable to scientific investigation, but hence susceptible to scientific challenges. It looks unlikely that the sciences are going to demonstrate that we entirely lack autonomy and responsibility, that it's an all or nothing threat, but it does look likely that the sciences, specifically social psychology, will show that we possess less autonomy than we tend to think, and hence are less responsible for our character and actions than we tend to assume. So I guess the answer to the title of my talk is no science threatens free will and autonomy except for maybe social psychology so far. And to answer the title of the conference, I don't know. But I think autonomy is the right ideal if you define it in certain ways. So what do I mean by autonomy? Well, here's the definition I'll give, and you can push me on it as you wish. An agent is autonomous, roughly, to the extent that she possesses the capacities, the cognitive and cognitive capacities to deliberate about various options for choice and the reasons for them, and to choose and act based on reasons that she has accepted, or at least reasons she would accept, were she to consider them. And the last phrase there is just, what's this about? The last phrase there is just to deal with sort of regress problems, or maybe the problems of being manipulated to accept certain reasons, and that adds a lot of complications we can talk about if you want, but for now I'll pass by it. So an autonomous agent possesses these capacities, and then she acts autonomously. Sorry, something bad happened. Okay. And then she acts autonomously if she has the opportunity to exercise those capacities and interactions. And then I don't take free will to be any mysterious or metaphysically obscure notion. Rather, to have free will is to possess the capacities for autonomy, and to act of one's own free will is to have the opportunity to exercise those capacities. Finally, I take autonomy to be a necessary condition for moral responsibility, for being genuinely deserving of praise and blame for one's actions. In some cases, that's going to involve your actions tracing back to earlier autonomous choices you made that may influence your later autonomous behavior. Just think about the choice to drive your car to a party where you know you'll be drinking. So, one key feature of this way of understanding autonomy is that it highlights that it's not an all or nothing notion, because people can possess the relevant reasoning and self-control capacities to varying degrees, and have more or less of an opportunity to exercise those capacities in different situations. And another feature of this view is that it naturalizes free will, autonomy, and responsibility. We can study the relevant cognitive and conative capacities just as we study other such capacities in humans and other animals. So while that means that autonomy can be studied scientifically, it also means that it can be challenged by scientific discoveries. So let's turn to such potential challenges now. Traditionally, in philosophy, if any science was going to be relevant to talk about free will and autonomy, it was going to be physics, since that's the science that can tell us whether or not determinism is true, and the philosophical debates have focused myopically on the question of determinism. So the argument goes like this: free will, and hence autonomy and responsibility, require that determinism is false. Science is showing, or at least might show, that determinism is true, so it's showing that we lack free will, etc. And determinism there is going to have a specific definition in these debates. It says a complete description of a system, perhaps the whole universe at one time, and the laws that govern that system entail a complete description of that system at any future time. Now I want to move us past this debate very quickly, since first I think it's irrelevant. I'm a compatibilist. But certainly I don't think it's the potential scientific challenge that any of the illusionists are talking about, or that's going to get any press and drive the effects, for instance, that we've seen in terms of changing people's behaviors when you tell them about free will. So, but just to get us past it, let me say briefly, is D1 true? That is, should we be incompatibilists? Well, first of all, most philosophers that study this are compatibilists. And one way to see that, or to recognize the plausibility of compatibilism, is to recognize that determinism as defined there clearly does not rule out that a person can possess various capacities, nor does it rule out her opportunity to exercise those capacities in action. So if the definitions I just offered are plausible at all, then determinism is irrelevant to free will, autonomy, and responsibility. And even if you think that free will requires indeterminism or some magical ability to create oneself from scratch, most theorists about autonomy would then distance autonomy from that sort of hyper-metaphysical view of free will, the agent-causal view perhaps, rather than have to embrace skepticism about autonomy, or rather than having to give up the nice distinctions between more and less autonomous agents who are then more or less responsible for their actions. And finally, I won't discuss it unless you want to ask me about it in the question period, but I've done some experimental philosophy studies on ordinary people's views about free will, and across a variety of studies, what I found is that typically non-philosophers, ordinary people, when you give them descriptions of determinism, take it to be compatible with free will and responsibility, unless they misunderstand determinism to mean something that it doesn't mean, to mean what I call bypassing, that somehow their mental processes are cut out of the loop and make no difference to what happens in their lives. Again, briefly, we can also consider whether premise 2 is true. So, first of all, it's probably not. The dominant theory in physics suggests indeterminism, but that should remind us that it's a strange view of autonomy and responsibility that entails that a team of physicists holed up in a lab at MIT could somehow demonstrate that we are not, and never have been, responsible in any degree for any of our actions. That seems to be a strange consequence of physics. Nor is it clear how, if they confirmed that indeterminism were true, that could help make us more free or responsible. It seems much more plausible that the sciences relevant to human autonomy are the sciences that study humans, such as psychology and neuroscience. But perhaps one thinks that those sciences could establish the truth of premise D2 there. That seems to be what some illusionists think. They think they're really discovering determinism to be true. So here's John Barb. He says, for every psychological effect, there exists a set of causes or antecedent conditions that uniquely lead to that effect. And in other places, they just use the language of determinism to describe what they're showing. But the mind sciences, psychology, neuroscience, are not in a position to establish the truth of determinism. They don't study a closed system. They don't study something that indeterminism, if it exists at all, would not affect. So if quantum physics turns out to be indeterministic, then the universe and we are indeterministic systems. So they can't establish determinism even if they wanted to. But it turns out that when illusionists talk about determinism, that's not really what they mean. And when they talk about free will being an illusion, they're not really talking about the traditional philosophical debate at all. Rather, they're thinking of other things. What is it? Well, one possibility is physicalism. That they think that free will requires, so physicalism here, I've just given a very weak statement of it, that what exists, including conscious mental states, is ultimately constituted by physical processes governed by laws of nature. And then they think, perhaps, that, well, free will and autonomy and responsibility require that physicalism is false, and that they're showing physicalism is true. So that's how they're showing that we lack free will and autonomy. Now, it's not obvious how neuroscience has or could conclusively demonstrate physicalism, even in this weak variety. But I do think the sciences in general increasingly provide inductive evidence for such a naturalistic view, or at least a weak form of physicalism, that says our minds are composed of physical things. In any case, I think physicalism is true, and I won't quarrel with premise 2 here. So the question then is, why should we think premise 1 is true? And it's not clear, but here's what the illusionists seem to think, and what I think most scientists who talk about how their research intersects with the free will debate think. They think, by definition, free will requires dualism, substance dualism. So here's just a few quotations to give you a feel for that assumption. Patrick Haggard, who we've already seen saying free will is an illusion, adds, why? Because there's no ghost in the machine. Benjamin Libet, who did the famous studies that people draw on over and over to show that free will is an illusion, the one where you flip your wrist and they find that when you're aware of your decision, your brain's already done something. I'll talk about similar studies in a little bit. He said, free will requires that conscious decisions can proceed to some degree independently of natural determinism, by which he means the natural laws that govern the activities of nerve cells in the brain. So by determinism, he means something like physicalism. Reed Montague, another neuroscientist, says free will is a close cousin of the idea of the soul. Your choices emerge wholly formed from somewhere indescribable and outside the purview of physical descriptions. And he goes on to say, so science just can't study free will at all. And Josh Green and Jonathan Cohen, in their much discussed paper where they argue that the law should assume that we don't have free will and proceed from there, do it based on this definition of free will, that it's dualist and libertarian. The mind and the brain are separate. Interactive entities, Cartesian dualism. Intuitive free will requires a rejection of determinism and an implicit commitment to magical mental causation. So, just as I think there's no reason to think the capacities required for autonomous action and responsibility are threatened by determinism, I don't think there's any reason to think they require such dualistic views either. And some of my other studies suggest that ordinary people don't think that as well. There's a minority who does, but the majority don't. Let's consider two arguments now that maybe press the physicalist challenge, but in different ways, each of which I take to be unsound. So first, going back to the first one I already put up, one might think, look, neuroscience is showing that physicalism is true, that our actions are somehow are caused by mental states, but not really by mental states, because those mental states have neural correlates, so it's the neural correlates who are doing it. P2, again, I take to be plausible, right? But I don't think P1 is plausible, that we have to assume that physicalism is false in order to have autonomy. So another way of pressing the argument would be a little bit more specific about what's going on in the brain. Autonomy requires, like I said in my definition, that bypassing is false, that our actions are caused by the appropriate mental capacities, the capacities to act on reasons you would accept, or that somehow conscious deliberation can play some kind of role in what we do. And then, so that premise I actually think is plausible. It's my definition, so I should, right? But then the question is whether or not neuroscience is giving us any reason to think that that sort of bypassing is true. First of all, we should recognize that premise B2 here is not entailed by premise P2, at least not without some complicated metaphysical arguments, maybe inspired by Jaguar Kim or something. But the neuroscientists aren't showing that those arguments are sound. So the question is whether the neuroscience is giving us any evidence for B2. And that's what I want to talk about briefly. I don't think B2 is plausible. As I said, it's not implied by P2. But put another way, neuroscience isn't going to demonstrate bypassing simply by providing evidence that our minds are, in some sense, our brain. Any more than biochemistry shows that genes are causally inert by showing that they correlate with and are composed of DNA molecules. So if we assume physicalism, the question is what the relevant evidence would be to suggest bypassing, to support premise B2 here. Here, the illusionists have used evidence that they interpret to mean that we are conscious of having made our decisions only after our brain has, quote, already made it, the decision for us. Okay, so this is the way it's put in an article just this month, or I guess now last month, but very recent article in Nature, and this is how it begins. Neuroscientists argue that consciousness of a decision may be a mere biochemical afterthought, with no influence whatsoever on a person's actions. According to this logic, they say free will is an illusion. We feel we choose, but we don't, said Patrick Haggard. And John Dylan Haynes, who I just ran into at breakfast, which was kind of weird, but he's here for another conference. He's a famous neuroscientist, and he said, I find it very difficult to deal with this. How can I call a will mine if I don't even know when it occurred and what it is decided to do? And just to reiterate that these illusionist proclamations are going mainstream, here's how one famous London newspaper put it, these same results. Sexy science. It's free will and illusion. Our brains have made a decision long before we consciously realize it. And again, you know, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in these debates, because there's a real sociological issue here about what's going to happen when these claims go mainstream and how people react to them. So what's the image that these people have in mind when they make these claims? Well, again, one possibility is the dualist image. So you've got the non-conscious brain processes. Doesn't work. You've got the non-conscious brain processes, and maybe they interact with the soul in a one-way direction. It's like epiphenomenalism in the old Huxley picture. And then the non-physical soul doesn't have anything to do, right? But I've suggested we put aside that picture because it rests on some shaky assumptions about how free will and autonomy should be defined, and the specific scientific evidence does little to substantiate it. So let's look at a more interesting image, This one suggests, it begins with the physicalist sort of assumption, and therefore it's amenable to scientific study about where what's happening in these brain processes that are the neural correlates of conscious reasoning or conscious decision making. And what they say is that there's evidence that those brain processes that are the correlates of deliberation and intention formation aren't doing any causal work in our decisions and our actions. They are, quote, biochemical afterthoughts that occur too late to do anything, where they're not hooked up to the brain processes that cause behavior. Now, on the face of it, that would be a crazy idea. Like, why would some part of our brain just be an afterthought and not hooked up to anything? Why would it have no causal effects? It would be a strange evolutionary thing to occur, to have a dead end in the brain. But this is one way to interpret, and I think the only plausible way to interpret the Libet and Wegner evidence. So, to illustrate how people are presenting that evidence, I'll discuss the John Dylan Haynes follow-up to Libet. So in the Libet studies, you just flex your wrist. In this one, people were in an MRI machine, and they were asked to decide freely to push either a left or right button whenever they felt like it, and to pay attention to when they felt the urge to press a button come upon them. And consistent with the Libet results, they found that the subjects generally reported that awareness of whatever you want to call it about half a second or less before they pressed the button. But then, going well beyond Libet's findings, Libet found some electrical activity occurring about half a second before that in the SMA region of the brain. But they found activity 7 to 10 seconds before in the frontopolar cortex that predicted, we'll have to talk about what they mean by predicted there, the actual muscle movement, which button would be pressed. And then about 5 seconds before, they found activity in the SMA predicting when the people would press the button. So they conclude, oops, were those quotes already up there? Yeah. So they conclude that this bolsters Libet's results. The subjective experience of freedom is no more than illusion. Our actions are initiated by unconscious mental processes long before we become aware of our intention to act. So there's not much space left for the operation of free will. So you might think that they've discovered evidence of the sort of bypassing that I'm worried about. The brain processes involved with consciousness and decision-making clearly come too late to be involved in the actual decision or action. But that conclusion's too hasty for several reasons. And I'll go through them quickly and we can come back to them if anybody's not convinced. But philosophers tend to be pretty convinced that there's something fishy going on with these claims. So it probably doesn't take much to convince you. So first of all, if you already think that conscious processes have neural correlates, then you should also expect that those conscious processes will take time to ramp up, and hence will have causal precursors. That is, conscious awareness isn't going to arise from nowhere and in no time. It's going to have causal precursors in the brain. So the early activity measured by the fMRI has to be identified with something, and maybe it shouldn't be identified with the actual decision, but rather with the causal precursors of the decision. Perhaps it's not that the decision occurred 7 seconds before we were aware of it, but that people were beginning to make a decision, or preparing to make a decision up to 7 seconds earlier. Or maybe what they're measuring is urges to move, and then people are making the decision at the time of awareness, typically acting on the urge because they have no reason not to. And those interpretations make a lot more sense when you realize that when they say that activity predicts, what they really mean is they're looking at the fancy statistical models and figuring out that there's a 10% higher than chance correlation between that brain activity and the particular button press people make. So there's nothing like even local determinism going on here. There's no evidence that any set of brain processes preceding awareness are causally sufficient for a particular decision. Even if there were, though, I'm not sure it would be a problem for some of the reasons I've just suggested, but also because, most importantly, none of the studies are considering the role of distal deliberation, reasoning, and planning. They're just looking at the proximal stuff that's going on in the brain. The subjects in these experiments are asked to follow the instructions, which ask them to act without planning and to act for no reason at all. So there's a sense in which they're aimed at limiting any proximal deliberation or decision making. So we might wonder whether this is about autonomy as we've defined it at all. This is the way Haynes describes the experiment in that Nature article. The design is aimed to ensure participants have no reason to make their choices. It was specifically emphasized that their decisions should be unbiased and spontaneous. And based on post-experimental questionnaires, it was ensured they made spontaneous decisions and did not pre-plan them. None reported having thought about the decision. So what we really need to know is whether people's forming a decision to push buttons whenever the urge came upon them had any effect on their behavior. Or on the physicalist picture, we want to know whether or not the neural correlates of reasoning, planning, and distal decision making have the appropriate downstream effects on behavior. So that even if this stuff is too late to affect action, we need to know whether this stuff affects action. None of the neuroscience experiments deal with that sort of earlier choice making and decision making or planning. On this picture, even if the awareness of the intention just before the button press isn't causally relevant, consciousness and reasoning can still matter. And in fact, that's when reasoning does matter. We typically care about things like free will and autonomy when it comes to making important, generally slow decisions, ones we ponder and deliberate about. It turns out that it would be really bad if, I mean, this is a little bit like what Sean was talking about yesterday in terms of automating your behavior. It would be bad to have to form conscious intentions before every keystroke you type, or every tennis stroke you hit, or even before every sentence you speak. If you did, you'd be a bumbling fool. So I, at least, want my conscious reasoning to make a difference when I'm considering things like what career to pursue, or how to plan my day, or whether to give money to charity or buy a new TV. And the neuroscience studies simply don't provide any evidence that the brain processes involved in that sort of conscious reasoning and decision making are causally bypassed. There's no evidence that bypassing is true as a general rule. So far I've been defending autonomy against potential scientific threats from determinism, physicalism, and the neuroscientific evidence. You might think, as Daniel Wegner once put it to me, that I have an agenda, that I'm mounting a rearguard defense of human autonomy and responsibility against the assault of the modern sciences. But quite the contrary. I'm all for naturalizing free will and autonomy, and that means that I make their borders susceptible to scientific incursions. I just want to make sure we define our terms properly so the challenges are appropriate and legitimate. Indeed, it's illusionists like Wegner who tend to define free will, or the will, as magical or non-natural in such a way that they think any scientific explanation would erode it. Furthermore, I think there are scientific challenges to our autonomy. They just don't come from determinism, physicalism, or the existing neuroscientific evidence. Rather, they come from social psychology. So one way to picture this threat that I'll talk about now is with a slight alteration to this picture, right? One that says the reasoning processes, even the ones involved in making judgments about moral decisions or planning or making decisions, and their neural correlates, they do their work only after we've acted or made our judgments. Their job is to rationalize what we've already done, rather than influence what we will do. And this is even for the sort of more slow, deliberative processes that the neuroscientists haven't studied yet. So having told you the good news, at least if you think autonomy as I've defined it is the right ideal, let's turn to the bad news part of the talk. But we better lighten the mood first, so we'll start with a cartoon from Dilbert. I don't know if you guys get Dilbert over in England, but Scott Adams has Dogbert say, "You can't resist the shard-filled ultra donuts even though you know the hazards. Free will is an illusion. People always choose the perceived path of greatest pleasure." Now rationalize your decision, you mindless pink robot. Gilbert said something. So the argument that fills in the schema that I set up at the beginning looks more like this. Start with a definition of autonomy, as I've defined it at least. And then the threat comes from sciences that, like social psychology, that may show we possess those capacities to a limited degree, and that we often lack the opportunity to exercise them. As we'll see, what they're suggesting is that we act based on situational factors we reject, and then only rationalize our actions afterwards. Now, unlike the earlier arguments, this scientific challenge does not conclude that free will is an illusion or that we lack autonomy entirely. Much more plausibly, it recognizes that autonomy is a degree concept and that we can possess it to varying degrees, and the evidence would then challenge the degree to which most of us possess those capacities or have the opportunity to exercise them. Though it certainly allows that different individuals may be more or less autonomous, or each person may be able to act more or less autonomously in different situations. Part of the project will be to use the empirical evidence to map the terrain more accurately, to discern how autonomous different people are, and hence how responsible they are for their actions, to learn which sort of situations diminish our autonomy, and perhaps use that information to augment our capacities for autonomy. So what I'll do now is just kind of zip through some of the evidence that I take to support premise 2 here, and then we can talk possibly about some responses to that. Much of this evidence you may be familiar with, so I'll go through it relatively quickly, and if you want me to return to talk about the actual studies more, I'd be happy to. Much of the evidence comes from the situationist tradition in social psychology, led by researchers such as Nisbet, Ross, and Wilson. Their research typically involves manipulating a subtle variable, a factor in the situation between two different groups, and showing that it makes a big difference in the behavior of the people of the groups. The people that have that situational variable act very differently than the ones that don't. Furthermore, people don't recognize the influence of those factors, and hence they seem to have little control over how they're influenced by them. They're not aware of that influence. And typically, if you ask them about it, they reject the idea that those factors could have any influence on them or anybody else for that matter, which I take to imply that those influences are not reasons people accept as legitimate. They're often influencing us to act against reasons we have or would accept for doing what we do. Some of the research involves trivial decisions about consumer buying and stuff like that. And maybe that's not that relevant to autonomy in some sense, but quite a bit of it deals with morally significant behavior, such as helping people in need. So you've probably heard about the Kitty Genovese studies that were done after she was, raped and murdered in a courtyard and nobody called the police. And so social psychologists came along and said it's not because those were cold New Yorkers. It's not their character, they had a bad character, it's that typically anybody, if you put them with impassive confederates, with other people around that aren't doing anything, they won't help. So in a series of studies, for instance, you give the exact same stimuli to two different groups, someone screaming or some smoke or something that involves a dangerous situation. If they're alone, 70% of people will do something. If there's a couple Confederates who aren't doing anything, 70% of people will sit without intervening. And it's a linear line. The more people around, the less you help. Similarly, the more in a hurry you are, the less you help. So the famous Good Samaritan study showed that people that were told they were in a hurry, they had to get somewhere quick to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan parable. 10% of those people helped, whereas 63% of the people who had time stopped to help. And here again, there's a lot of studies that show people are less likely to help because of these sorts of factors, but they're all factors that when you ask people whether or not it influenced them, they say no, and if you ask them whether or not it should influence them, they say no. Similarly, if you have people, if people walk by a passerby who drops their papers, people are much more likely to help if they're in a better mood. For instance, they've just found a dime in a payphone, or they smell the smell of a bakery. And they're less likely to help if there's things like lawnmowers going on outside. Sometimes these effects are relatively small but statistically significant, but which to me is always, you know, not as exciting as big differences. But as you've seen from some of these, some of them are quite large effects, not just statistically significant. Similarly, there's the conformity effects that are widespread in social psychology, beginning with Solomon Asch, who showed that when you have 3 lines on a board and ask which of them matches some other line, if you have a few Confederates give the wrong answer, most people will then give the wrong answer. And what's interesting is some very recent fMRI studies by a guy at Emory named Byrne have suggested that the effect can be driven not just because people are trying to conform, sort of, you know, they know it's the wrong answer, but they give it anyway. It actually changes the way they perceive the length of the lines. And that highlights an important aspect of these studies, which is the subtle situational effects can alter both the way we perceive situations and the way we decide to respond to the situation as we perceive it. So passive bystanders lead us to see needy people as less needy, as well as making us less likely to help even if we do decide that they're needy. So if we can be influenced by these unnoticed situational factors so much, the flip side is that we may lack character. Traits such as generosity, courage, and honesty may not hold up across situations the way we expect them to. And John Doris has made this point famously to argue against virtue ethics. But I want to use it just to point out that what we take to be our principles for action, our sort of the reasons we accept, may get disrupted too often and too easily to think of them really as principles that we're acting on. The most famous study suggesting conformity, that conformity easily trumps compassion, of course, is Milgram's experiment, which you probably know about. 2/3 of subjects would, under relatively mild commands from an experimenter, shock another person past the point where he begs for release and past the point where he stops responding, seemingly unconscious or dead. The variation that gets discussed less often is the one that astounds me the most. That's the one where the teacher has to hold the person's hand down on a shock plate. So it's the touch proximity condition, and still 1/3 of the subjects went all the way to 450 volts. I take this result to suggest that we too easily give up our autonomy in the face of authority. Most subjects clearly felt bad about what they were doing. That is, they were acting against their better judgment, but they continued on just the same. Another famous study that shows how easily we lose our principles as we take on different roles is Zimbardo's prison experiment at Stanford. As you probably know about, it was abandoned in less than a week because the guards became cruel and the prisoners became meek in ways that none of them found acceptable when they talked about it later in the cool condition, condition of thinking about it retrospectively. Zimbardo was called as a witness for the Abu Ghraib guards a couple years ago, and this is how he described them. He said they had surrendered their free will and personal responsibility during these episodes of mayhem. They were trapped in a unique situation in which the behavioral context came to dominate individual dispositions, values, and morality to such an extent they were transformed into mindless actors. It may be relevant to my discussion, they were still found guilty. Another implication of these studies is that we often don't know what is influencing us to act or to make judgments. We neglect the situational influences on others and ourselves and assume that people are acting in accord with character traits or principles, even when they aren't. So in their famous study on introspection in 1977, Nisbet and Wilson conclude that when people are asked to report how a particular stimulus influenced a particular response, they're not actually consulting a memory of the mediating process. They're not introspecting accurately on what they were influenced by. Rather, they're applying or generating causal theories about the effects of that type of stimulus on that type of response, theories that they apply retroactively. And they say it's frightening to believe one has no more certain knowledge of the workings of one's own mind than would an outsider with intimate knowledge of one's history and the stimuli present. And I do think it's a bit frightening because it suggests that we don't have the sort of self-knowledge that I've suggested autonomy requires. So to the extent they're right, it suggests we can't access the reasons for our actions, and as we've seen in some cases, we would reject what actually does influence us. Again, this conclusion is bolstered by a massive literature on cognitive biases, which I won't discuss in any detail, but here they are. I mean, typically what this literature suggests is that we can be led to reason poorly so as to, for instance, confirm what we already believe, the confirmation bias, or to substantiate unconscious prejudices that we hold, or we make all kinds of inferential mistakes about probability judgments and other sort of judgments, which we can only correct if we have significant information and training. And the upshot is that we're poorly reasoning, in some cases, presumably in ways that will affect our actions. More evidence comes from the automaticity literature, which grows daily, but I won't dwell on it because, as I've discussed earlier, I think our autonomy can be enhanced if we're able to automatize learned behaviors so that we can act on reasons we've accepted without having to rethink them every time we act. But, on the other hand, some of the automaticity studies are troubling. For instance, the ones that on implicit racism and other biases that suggest that our intuitive judgments and actions are influenced in ways that we would reject if we were to consciously know about them. And then finally, I'll discuss the research on rationalization, especially rationalizing our moral judgments. So Jonathan Haidt argues that our moral judgments and presumably much of our moral behavior is driven by quick emotional intuitions. And then, if need be, we come up with reasons after the fact to rationalize those intuitions to ourselves or others. For instance, he tells subjects stories that provoke disgust reactions, but don't involve harm to any other people. He tells them, for instance, about a brother and sister who decide to have sex, but just once, and with double protection, and they enjoy it and keep it a secret. And then most people say it's still immoral, and they're asked to explain why. And their reasons typically avert to the types of harm that the case explicitly stipulates are not present. We can come back to that because in just a second. But similarly, Fiery Cushman and Leanne Young have extended that paradigm to find that when you give people moral scenarios and ask them to make judgments, and then ask them why they're making those judgments, they're often dumbfounded. They're not able to come up with reasons for those judgments, yet they stick with those judgments nonetheless. And Josh Green argues that our Kantian judgments are often based on our emotional aversion to physically harming others, not on our reasoning about the effects of such harm. For instance, in the famous trolley cases, most people say it's right to switch a track so the train would kill 5. So to move a trolley so that a train that would kill 5 people is moved to a track with only 1 person on it, but the vast majority of people say they wouldn't push the large man in front of the train to prevent it from killing 5. And Green provides what he takes to be neurobiological evidence that this difference is driven largely by our emotional aversion to direct contact, to directly contacting others to do them harm. Well, we can talk about some of that evidence, but first I'll tell you about a study I ran because I was trying to show that these rationalization accounts were wrong, and that interpretations of the trolley problem were mistaken. I was motivated, or at least I thought I was, by a confound in these studies. Most of them, including the incest case and the footbridge case that asks about pushing 1 to save 5, involve highly implausible stipulations. For instance, that no harm might come from an incestuous affair, or that a person's body will stop a runaway train. And even if people try to accept those stipulations, they'd still rightly believe that the agents in the cases aren't justified in believing that they don't risk doing serious harm. For instance, killing 6 in the footbridge case, because the train will run over the fat man and then kill 5 more. So basically, I was picking up on a sentiment expressed by Kenneth on 30 Rock. Do y'all get that show over here in London? It's a very funny show if you haven't seen it. So Jack Donaghy, his boss, says, say you're on a lifeboat. And Kenneth, who's a little dim, says, you're on a lifeboat. The boat holds 8 people, but you have 9 on board. Either you'll capsize and everyone will drown, or one person can be sacrificed to save the others. Now, how do you decide who should die? And Kenneth, who's from Stone Mountain, Georgia, where I'm from, or near where I'm from, oh, I don't believe in hypothetical situations, Mr. Donaghy. That's like lying to your brain. Right? So basically, he's picking up on what I'm picking up on, which is that these situations are lying to our brain. They're making us, they're forcing us to kind of hold implausible things in mind simultaneously. So I tried to do this with the trolley problem. With Bradley Thomas, my student, we designed trolley cases that tried to correct for the unbelievability confound, or to test for it. So we designed a footbridge case that we took to be more believable. Just like the original case, the action of pushing the worker off the footbridge still kills 1 person as a foreseen and intended means to achieve the goal of saving 5, and it's physically personal. It involves active harm. But unlike the original case, we added that the train has that the worker, Steve here, is a railway worker who knows that this train is equipped with an automatic braking system that stops the train immediately after it hits an object. And we also put the fence up so he can't jump himself, because some subjects often complain, well, why didn't the person jump instead of pushing the fat man? And we also, I won't put it up here, but we, so it seems like Steve is more justified in believing that this action would work, okay? We also came up with a switch case that was unbelievable, which I won't discuss. So what were the results? Well, disappointingly for what I thought would be a cool science paper, although you'll see I still think the results are interesting, but there was no difference in judgments about the moral permissibility of the acts between the believable and the unbelievable cases. Both the footbridge cases, the one we created in the original, people said it's impermissible. Both the switch cases, people said it's the right thing to do. But here's the kicker. We also asked whether it was believable that pushing 1 would save 5, and whether Steve was justified in thinking his action would work to save 5. And there were no significant differences between what we took to be the believable case and the original unbelievable case. And same with the switch. Same with the judgments about justification. So you might think, well, bad experiment. Your manipulations failed. You didn't create something that people found believable. To test for that, we took the cases and we took out the morality. Right? So here's what we take to be the believable scenario, but there's no moral decision making here. It's just you're pushing a crash test dummy to save 5 pieces of luggage. I mean, it's not very moral if it is, right? And then we ask, is it believable that the train will get stopped if Steve does this? And is Steve justified in believing it? And the answer is, yeah. People thought, when we took out the moral features, you get those expected, the ones we were trying to manipulate, you get those expected differences in believability judgments and the justified belief judgments between what we designed to be unbelievable cases and believable cases. So, the conclusion one might draw here, and the one that we think is accurate, is whereas I was attempting to show that people were making moral judgments in part based on a very plausible moral principle, that it's only justified to do harm if you're justified in believing that the harm you do will prevent more harm. So there's an epistemic condition to moral judgments. And that's what I think that's a plausible principle. And I think people are applying it in these cases, but they're applying it after the fact to rationalize their moral intuitions. At least that's the way I interpret the data. It looks like people are adjusting their epistemic intuitions to match their moral intuitions. It seems like they're rationalizing their moral judgments in part with their judgments about the believability of the cases. And if you've ever taught a trolley problem case to your students, you know lots of people complain about how silly it is to think a fat man will stop a trolley. But it may be that they're just coming up with that response to rationalize their gut reaction that you shouldn't do that, and they might try and do the same sort of things with more believable cases. So So far, I've offered a quick tour of various types of evidence that suggest support for premise 2 of that rationalization argument, that social psychology is showing that our capacities for acting on reasons we accept or have accepted are limited. Those capacities are not as extensive as we tend to assume, and we probably lack the opportunity to act on those capacities more than we think. And if we do have those capacities, in some cases, maybe we're using them to rationalize more unreasonable judgments or actions we're making. Where does that leave us? Well, a long way from establishing the exact scope of the results and of the threat. We don't know how pervasive this is. Many of the situationist studies focus on decisions or actions that are relatively trivial and for which we might not really have reasons or reasons we care much about. So like I said, a lot of it's consumer behavior, or even some of them on things like why you are attracted to or dating the person you're dating, where as Sean reminded us yesterday, we don't typically want to be able to give reasons or explanations for why we make those decisions. And many of the studies are designed precisely to find the situational factor that will influence us without our knowledge. We have little knowledge of how many failed experiments there are, right? Cases where they couldn't get the result that they were looking for by manipulating some subtle situational variable. So it may be that we're finding the equivalent of visual illusions in these experiments, that we're finding the exceptions to the rule of generally reliable cognitive processes. And again, almost every study asks for people's reasons only after the fact, so some of the problems may be due to failure of memory rather than failure of self-knowledge or introspection. So it looks like what we need are more experiments that test the effects of prospective reasoning, planning, and distal decision-making to see how and when our actions can be influenced by reasons we want to motivate us. There have been some studies on planning and the forming of conscious, what's called implementation intentions, and they suggest that there is such a prospective causal influence. But there haven't really been much studies on, for instance, the role of moral reasoning, especially social moral reasoning, on people's future behavior. And there haven't been many studies even on, so that's the crucial experiment. So we haven't, there haven't even been much on just planning, other than those implementation studies, how the effects of planning and reasoning can influence your actions, say, an hour later or a day later. Furthermore, we need to do some cognitive neuroscience to start figuring out where those neural correlates of conscious reasoning are, or what the nature of those processes are, and whether they're in the causal loop, and how they're in the causal loop. And finally, the social psychology work could be helpful by teaching us to attend to situational influences or biases that we otherwise would miss, and perhaps to provide us with strategies to counteract such influences. In that case, knowledge would be power, and we may increase our autonomy. So hopefully we can discuss some of these possible responses a little bit more in the Q&A, but let me just conclude by saying, if we want a scientifically informed conception of autonomy, and I think we should want that, then we should dump any conception that's non-natural or that's all or nothing or that worries about determinism. We should replace it with a conception in terms of natural capacities that are possessed and exercised to varying degrees, though, as we've seen, that makes them susceptible to scientific challenges. The good news is perhaps the illusionist challenges from the neuroscientific data rely on either a non-natural conception or they misinterpret the relevance of their own data to these debates. The rationalization challenges from social psychology suggest more significant limitations to our autonomy, but the degrees of freedom we have are still a wide open question, and the research may even suggest ways to develop our capacities for autonomy. So, thank you very much.